This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. We just closed out the first month of Dominaria United Limited. It's been a great format, that's the general consensus, it's one I agree with. There's really good color balance, and I think that you can be an aggressive deck or a really grindy domain deck, and they're all viable, and that makes it a very nice format. And one we can talk about a lot and still have more to talk about, and that's what we're doing today, talking about the format some more. And in particular, I want to talk about 10 cards in the set that you should stop playing, or at least play a lot less of. These are cards that I see people playing regularly, and they're cards that, when we look at the data, it's clear that people mostly shouldn't be playing them. If you're wondering what I mean by data, I'm talking about 17 lands. You can check them out at 17lands.com. It's a great resource for sort of seeing data for thousands and thousands of drafts, how cards are performing and things like that. And in this video, I picked the cards as cards that, I think people need to play a lot less or not at all, that I see on a regular basis. And then I went and looked at the data, and the data backs it up. So I wanted to talk about it in particular, mention the data in particular, and not just how I'm feeling about the card. That way, it's not just me saying this, it's the data. So let's go ahead and dive right in. These aren't really in any particular order. They're just 10 cards that I've seen people playing way too much of. Another way to put this is to say that these are cards that when my opponent plays them, I feel pretty good about the situation because they're putting themselves at a disadvantage by playing a card that isn't really worth a whole card or the mana they're paying for it. As we'll see, every single card on this list has a lower win rate when you draw it than when you don't draw it. And that tells you enough right there that these are cards that lower your win rate actively when they become part of your hand. And that is not so good. So let's dive right in. Inscribed Tablet is the card I want to talk about first. It's the one I've seen the most. I think it's the card that people are playing, way too much of, even more than the rest of these. And I get to some extent why people are playing it. It lets you sift through lands and find one from the top of your library. And yeah, that does have a place in this format. I mean, there's the Floriferous Wall, Vine Wall, I guess, that kind of does the same thing. And that's partly why this card, what makes this card look bad, especially, is the fact that when you have the Vine Wall around, you have a card that actually adds to the board that does the exact same thing. And this does not add to the board. And yeah, you're like, well, hey, I can draw a card sometimes. And that's true. If this card would allow you to just choose to draw the card if you didn't want a land, it would be way, way better. It wouldn't be on this list at all, but it doesn't. If you see a land, you have to take it. The only way you get to draw is if you don't see a land at all. So yeah, this card, when you draw it, lowers your win rate by 2.4 percentage points. And that tells you a lot right there. There's just better ways to help you get domain. It's a thing in the format. There's the Vine Wall, but there's just countless other cards too. I mean, just playing a duel over Inscribed Tablet is going to be better most of the time. It just doesn't do enough. It's a very bad way to try to find a land because it will never, ever add to the board for you. Next, there is Vanquishers Axe and Hero's Heirloom. Both of these are equipment, so I'm going to talk about them together. The Axe is definitely the worst of the two. It lowers your win rate by a whopping 6.4% when you draw it. Hero's Heirloom, not good either. It lowers your win percentage by 3.5%. So the equipment in this format is weird. They include it a little bit, and then there's like a couple rares that care about equipment. But there's really not big payoffs for playing artifacts either. And so even though both of these cards, like in a vacuum, look kind of okay, I mean, especially the Heirloom looks like a decent piece of equipment in a set with a bunch of legendaries, because there's zero synergy or almost zero synergy to go around for them, they just end up being bad ways to buff your creatures. I mean, this format has no shortage of like really good tricks and stuff, which will have a way bigger impact on combat and things like that. Like, you would much rather play Take Up the Shield than either of these cards. It even offers a permanent counter, and that really shows you the difference here in power level between these. And yes, these are colorless. You can play them in any deck, but you just don't ever end up in a deck where you should be playing these. They they can augment your creatures, but if you're in the market to do that, you have way, way better ways to do it especially with counters and tricks. It's just not that hard to make it happen. There's mass board pump that's very aggressively costed, so you just don't need these. They just don't have a spot in the format, and these are cards that, they're not just like terrible on face value. If this format had an equipment sub-theme, they'd move way up, or a legitimate artifact sub-theme, they'd move way up. But it doesn't have either of those, and there's just better ways to augment your creatures, so you should never play these. Next up, there is Lana War Stalker. So 1 mana for a 1/1 just doesn't cut it in Limited. It really never has. I mean, you need to have a really significant text box to overcome it, because that's a body that becomes irrelevant. The best it can do is chump block pretty quickly, and that's bad, in Limited. That means you're not really getting a full card worth of value. The Stalker does have a text box, and it gains power, +1/+0, every time a creature enters the battlefield. And, there is a go wide theme in the format, including in green-white, but even with all of that in mind, this card is just super underwhelming. Lowers your win rate by 4.6% when you draw it. So again, remember, when I'm saying this, what I mean is, according to the data, when you don't draw this card, you have a 4.6% higher chance of winning than when you do draw it. And that shows you how actively bad they are. They're not just like, it's okay. It's like, no, you would be better off drawing a whole lot of other cards than drawing this. And that's, the evidence is there. And yeah, it raises its power. But the problem is, this format has, especially in white, a bunch of tokens who aren't really worth a whole card themselves, and they can just block this and kill it. It also dies to, a lot of 1 mana removal, which isn't the end of the world. I mean, it only costs 1 itself, but it's very challenging to generate enough value with this 1-drop for it to be worth playing in your deck. And this format has no shortage of pretty good aggressive creatures, but you still don't end up wanting to play the Stalker most of the time. I do think this card can have a home on occasion if you're in a deck, especially in green-white, that has a lot of ways of making tokens. And, one of the problems with data's not perfect, is we're getting these win rates based on when people are just jamming this card into a deck, right? So if someone's playing these all in suboptimal decks, it's going to pull their number down. Whereas if they were only playing it in a deck where it was at its absolute best, it would pull the number up. So there are some... Data's not perfect. It can tell a story, but you do have to critically think about it. But nonetheless, this thing is not worth the full card in 99% of decks, even if you have a lot of other stuff going on with tokens. It's the kind of card that barely makes the cut and is mostly a card you should never play. Next up, I want to talk about Coalition Sky Knight. So this one's kind of surprising to me. I knew it, in the beginning of the format, I thought it would be fine. I think in the set review, I gave it at least a C and maybe even a C+. The idea of having an enlist creature that flies is like, okay, that's exactly what I want. I want to be able to just, convert some power on the ground into evasive power. And, that's a thing. But it's really surprising how bad this card has been overall. And part of the problem is that there are several 1 mana removal spells that can kill it. There are bounce spells that really hurt the tempo. Like 4 mana for a 2/2 is a miserable cost. Getting it killed by Flowstone Infusion, by your opponent is just devastating. I mean, that's the kind of exchange that can really change a game because of the difference in mana you and your opponent spent. And then, there are enough flyers in this set that it's not like this thing can just rumble in the sky and not have any problems. I mean, there's even a 1 mana 1/1 Death Toucher with flying. You'd have to pay mana to give it flying, but it's just not like, the skies are open for this 2/2 to swing through, even when you're enlisting it. And yeah, it's, of the cards on this list, it's the one that people are overrating the most based on the data, because when you draw it, it lowers your win rate by almost 4%, but it's also picked on average, average last seen as is the Saturn 17 land, as a 5th pick. So that one there's a huge disparity. For a lot of the ones we've looked at so far, they're at least cards people are taking late and then putting into their deck. This is something people are taking early and putting into their deck, and it's actively hurting them. So don't be that person. Next up, I've got Shieldridge Restoration. So this thing is one that I talked about in my 10 cards I was wrong about in this set, because I thought it was going to be pretty nice. I like the idea that you could reanimate with it early, get something beefy early. And then I also like the idea that in the late game, you could kick it and gain life. But it's ended up just being really awkwardly positioned in the format. Part of it is some of the things that you do really want to be reanimating in the format, like, if you could reanimate a turn 4 Tolarian Serpent, that would be pretty cool, but you have to take a bunch of damage. Like, the big common creatures all have high mana values, so if you do get them in your graveyard early and try to reanimate them, it's going to hurt. And then beyond that, there aren't that many other creatures at common and uncommon that are even worth reanimating, because a lot of them have these sort of weak base forms that get better when you kick them. And if you're just reanimating, a 5 mana 3/4 flyer or something like that with this, it's really not worth the mana that you're spending or the life that you're losing. So it's just awkwardly positioned. If this format had a more legit reanimator deck and some nice things to reanimate, that would be cool. There, the one card at common or uncommon that does work really well with this, but it's so hard to set up, is the 7 mana 7/7 Trampler that gains you 5 when it enters the battlefield. Like, if you can reanimate that on turn 4, it doesn't matter. You're really only paying 3 because you gain back 5. I guess, yeah. I think the math might be slightly off there. But the point is, it offsets the danger of losing the life, and then you have this huge beater. But it's an uncommon, and you're not going to get multiples very often. This is an uncommon too. This is another one that's taken pretty highly. It lowers your win percentage by 2.5% when you draw it. And it's last seen as a 6.29, which means people are spending like a 6th pick on this. And most of the time it shouldn't make the cut, so that's not so good. Next, there is Founding the Third Path. This is one I've talked about before that I got some pushback on. It was in my 10 cards that I was wrong about, because I thought this was going to be kind of an okay enabler. But it really hasn't been. As I discussed in that video, sure, it can set you up by milling some stuff, and then you can cast a card from your graveyard, but you really don't end up doing more than getting a really convoluted 1-for-1 here. You don't gain a card, which the first chapter, which may give you a discount on a spell, but a lot of the time it won't even really do that. The second chapter, milling you, can set some stuff up sometimes. And then, the chapter 3 sometimes is useful, but you end up, just casting you still have to pay the mana for it. So you're just getting a card back from your graveyard to cast it, and you're spending a card to do it. And and it's a card that doesn't really add to the board. And that just isn't worth a card in limited. It's a very, slow, convoluted thing. And none of the stuff it does is all that powerful. And that's why when you draw it, it lowers your win percentage by almost 5%, which is quite bad. And it's the last of these. There have been 3 in a row here that are all taken kind of highly and are also bad, whereas the rest of these are at least not taken super highly. And this one is taken around a 7th pick, which is just bonkers to me, because frankly, I don't think this should really fit into any deck, even one with a bunch of Tolarian Terrors that can get extra value out of the mill. It just seems like you'd rather have, Impulse in this slot than you ever would Founding the Third Path. Next up, there is Smash to Dust. So, this is not a bad sideboard card, but it isn't that easy to find situations where you're doing a good job with this. I mean, sure, there are defenders in the format, but killing your opponent's Wingmantle Chaplain isn't going to matter because it's already in play and it already did its thing. And sometimes killing a Wingmantle Chaplain is a bad idea. If your opponent has black mana, they might just get it back and cast it again. So, there are other defenders that are more worth killing than the Chaplain, but the Chaplain is the one you're worried about. Your opponent sometimes will have a bunch of X1s that this can kill, which is cool. But those things don't line up often enough for this to be in your main deck. Killing a defender with this isn't worth the card. Most of the time, none of the modes are going to give you enough value to matter. It's not a bad sideboard card because you do go up against some really aggressive decks in the format where you have a bunch of they have a bunch of X1s, and it can really do some damage. But people are playing it in the main deck, and that's not so good because drawing it lowers your win percentage by 2.4%, which really shows you how underwhelming the card is when you draw it. Next up, it is Warhost's Frenzy. So, yeah, this is another card that, like, wouldn't be the worst thing ever in some formats, but it suffers for a number of reasons. And, you know, it lowers your win percentage by almost 5% when you draw it. So it's one of the worst cards we're talking about here. So keep that in mind. Yeah, so I have played this before, but only out of desperation, because you do want mass pump effects, especially in red-white, you know, of the red decks. And this does do the job, but there are way better ways, as we already discussed, to buff your whole board. And just isn't, like, that powerful anyway. You know, the effect seems really cool. You know, going into the review, it's like, you know, kicking this and then getting to draw for everything that dies is pretty nice. Like, it can keep you going, right? And you can even use it defensively to draw cards when you have to block. And it's like, yeah, those things are true, but most of the time, you know, you'd much rather have a pump that boosts toughness. Like, you'd rather have +1/+1 than +2/+0, because for mass pump effects to be really good, they have to be good other than when you kill your opponent with them. And this one just isn't. I mean, even when the cards replace themselves, right? Most of the time when you're doing this all-out swing, it's sort of your last attempt to win the game. And even drawing cards in the aftermath of that isn't going to be enough to save you if it didn't kill your opponent. So basically, you're only casting this when you want it to kill your opponent, and when it doesn't, which is, you know, a significant percentage of the time based on the data, you're just going to lose. Even with the extra card draw, even if you're kicking it, you're still going to lose. Your opponent's board, you know, will be in much better shape, and they're going to turn the game around and stabilize a huge chunk of the time. And the last of these 10 cards that you should be playing less of, I have Combat Tactics. This is the one that I think is the least bad on the list, and the data backs it up. It lowers your win percentage only by 1.5%. And I do think this card has an actual place sometimes, especially in blue-white or blue-red, where you have a bunch of evasive creatures, especially if you have some legendaries. Putting this on Balmor, for example, is pretty spicy. But people are playing it way too much. So this is one where it's not quite like you have to stop playing it, but people are just putting this like in any blue deck, and it is bad if your deck doesn't have enough evasion. Even if your deck does have enough evasion, it's still not a great card. Like most auras, it sets you up for potentially problematic 2-for-1s, you know, and that's not so good. And even the Ward 1 on a legendary creature isn't the most impressive of protection. So it's never like a great card. I do think it, like I said, it's a solid card to have in blue-red and blue-white. Everywhere else, it's miserable. You just need to have a bunch of flyers. And as I've noted, there are a lot of flyers in this set in general, so actually getting in with a flyer isn't that great. You know, putting it on a Haunting Figment can be kind of cool, but the 2-for-1 risk is super real because it only has 1 toughness and dies to everything. So I do think this card, if people stop playing it when they shouldn't, will see its win percentage go up. But it probably is just going to be like a kind of card that improves your win rate by like 0.2% or something even then. So it's not a great card, but the data says, and I've seen a lot of people playing this and just like slapping it on a regular creature and then not really being able to do anything with it. You've got to be able to draw at least 1 card with it before your creature dies or you get blown out. Even then, you're not doing great because your opponent's setting you back on board pretty significantly when they do kill it. But, you know, if you draw 2 with it, you're doing great. But it's just harder to set up than it seems like it might be. It's not a very good version of this effect overall. Sometimes we see these cards and they're pretty good, but there's not enough of an advantage in having flyers in this format for you to be confident you're going to crack in with things. So, yeah, Combat Tactics, the least bad of these. You can fit it into a decent chunk, you know, I don't know, 20% of your blue-red and blue-white decks or something like that and have it be reasonable, but the rest of the time you shouldn't be playing it. All right, so as usual, let's close things out with a pack, crack a pack. We're going to look at a pack one, pick one situation, talk about the cards in it, how I feel about them, and then tell you which one I would first pick. So our first common is Academy Wall. This thing is fine in like I mean, it is a little awkward. I think it's really only at home in blue-black and then in any deck that has Wingmantle Chaplain in it. And I don't love blue-black, as I've talked about before. I feel like it's neither aggressive enough nor domainy enough to succeed consistently. All the color pairs are playable in the format, but I do think it's the weakest. And so it does need a fairly particular home. You need the Defender deck or a blue-black deck. In any of the other decks, in blue-red, most of the time you want to be attacking a bunch, so even though it's a spell payoff, you don't really want to be playing it because it has Defender, and that makes your Balmor triggers and things not really matter, and that's kind of what you're trying to avoid. So I wouldn't take Wall early, and really it's not a card I go after at all unless I'm in the right deck. Eerie Soul Tender is next. This has been a pretty solid little card. 3 mana, 3/1, not the greatest stat line ever, but it can trade off reasonably well. And then the effect from the graveyard, like the format ends up being grindy enough, often enough, that it matters. Not to bring up Wingmantle Chaplain again, but it's part of what makes even just having one Chaplain so good is that you have all these ways to get creatures back from your graveyard, cast it again and get the trigger, and the Soul Tender can do it, but it actually is playable in most black decks, either setting up some graveyard stuff for you or just helping you get back a powerful creature after it dies. Not something you first picked, though. Yavimaya Sojourner is next. This is a solid card for the domain decks in the format. Not too hard to cast on turn 4, sometimes on turn 3, and it is a pretty real roadblock. It's not like your win condition in your domain deck, but it is a solid card to have around. I think I would take Soul Tender over it. Next up, we have Sunbathing Rootwalla. I think this would be our new first pick. This thing early is a decently statted creature that can trade or attack or whatever. And then in the later game, it becomes a real menace to deal with. Sometimes you can blow an opponent out because you block with something and they use the ability and then you kill it with Flowstone Infusion or whatever, and that feels great. But there are frequently also times where you're just looking at this thing and you're like, wow, that can hit me for 7. I have nothing that can stop it. So it ends up being a great card. It's fine in green aggressive decks, and it's nice in domain decks too, so it's nice that it sort of slots in wherever. It's a card that I've liked a reasonable amount. I hope we don't first pick it, but it's certainly the best of these first 4 commons. Next up, we got Soaring Drake, solid flyer. Not that much more to say about it. I definitely take the Rootwalla over it. Jaya's Fire Nado, clunky removal spell that you'll play one of if you have to. Certainly not something you take early. Floriferous Vinewall. This has been a card that's been pretty nice for domain decks. It, adds to the board. We were talking about it in relation to Inscribed Tablet earlier, right? And this does the same thing for the same amount of total mana, but adds to the board. And that matters because the domain decks are usually, especially if they're matched up against aggro, they have to hang on for dear life in the early game. And this helps them find and get domain going while also allowing them to absorb some damage. And that is a pretty nice effect to have. And all the domain decks are usually base green anyway, so you don't ever want the tablet, and this is why. There are just better ways to do it, and the Vinewall certainly does. That said, we're still on the Rootwalla. Citizen's Arrest will convince us to go in that direction, though. It's a great removal spell. It is double white, so it is sort of priced out of range for domain decks. That's the downside. If you have a bunch of white cards in your domain deck and you can run enough white sources, you'll play it. But any of the removal or anything that has 2 colored mana symbols does become kind of a problem when you are playing domain. But still, it's a great removal spell. Hard to say no to. Volshe Tide Turner. This is a card that could have been on this list, the main list in this video. It's super underwhelming, but it's not quite as bad as most of what we saw. You very rarely find yourself tapping it for real mana. I'm 60 plus drafts in or whatever. I've seen it maybe 3 times, and it's just not doing much most of the time other than being a 2-drop. So we're still on the Arrest. Splatter Goblin, a nice 2-drop for both aggressive decks and domain decks, which is nice. Any card where you can say that is nice because, if you're an aggressive deck, it's the kind of attacker that can do some damage early and sort of frustrate your opponent because of its death trigger. And then if you're a domain deck, you can really use it to make the aggressive decks sort of have a problem because a lot of them have X1s in play early and they can't really attack into this with their 2/2 and also lose a 1/1. So it ends up being a surprising sort of speed bump for your opponent to deal with. Still Citizen's Arrest, though. Next up, we have the red-white Signpost uncommon, one of them anyway. Baird, pretty easy to generate tokens with, and that is what you want to be doing with red-white. You can get it going with Enlist, you can get it going with a counter, you can get it going with a combat trick. Some creatures just have abilities like the 3-mana, 2/3 Menace Kavu just has an ability where you get a token if you want one, basically, every turn if you invest 1 red mana. So it's been very nice. I do think you take Arrest over it. He's not, like, so good. He's not a Signpost that is just, like, utterly bonkers. There are some of those in this set, like Wrath and Bortuk Bone Rattle, that I have a pretty hard time passing unless there's a bomb in the pack, but Baird isn't really one of those. I'll play him in every red-white deck, and he is very good, but I think just taking removal's better than him. Valduvian Berserker is next. This card has been a little awkward, as I kind of thought it would be in the set review. There are definitely games where, your opponent's at single-digit life, and this is a big problem, but there's also games where they can kind of just ignore the Berserker or block it and not be too worried about the downside. It does have a cool effect, and there are definitely games where it is a big problem, but it does have sort of a wild range, and starting out as a 3-mana 1/3 is pretty miserable. That was an interesting way to say miserable. But anyway, next up we got Heirloom Battle Hymn. I do think this knocks off Citizen's Arrest as our first pick now. 3 mana to do 4 to anything is great. It's very playable. You can splash it in whatever deck, including domain decks. And the kicker is nice too. One of the things that the domain decks especially can do against the aggro decks is play Heirloom Battle Hymn and Tolarian Geyser, both of which have this life gain upside, which really helps you stabilize. But the Battle Hymn is great in any deck, and so it leaves your options really wide open while still being really powerful. However, we have a great rare. I think this is one we've had in another Crack-a-Pack, actually, and it's Herd Migration. So, yeah, it does take some work. You can just slap Heirloom Battle Hymn in any deck, and it's going to be good, right? Herd Migration does take some work, and I have found, lately at least, the domain decks are harder to make work because everyone wants to do it, so it's harder to get the lands. So they have kind of, draft is self-correcting, and while I think domain is the strongest when you can get it going, it has become harder to get it going. So I'm a little more hesitant to take Herd Migration now than I was a few weeks ago. I do still think we take it. It's not that hard to set it up, even today, with the dual lands being taken more highly. Getting 5 bodies out of this isn't hard, and in the early game, it has the awesome effect of also being useful because it can set up your mana and gain you life so that you can take advantage of getting domain. So it's a big, great domain win condition type card that's also an enabler for domain. So I think it's what we take. I do think the Battle Hymn is close, much closer now than I would have said like 3 weeks ago. But I still think you take the Migration. It's just, it'll feel like a bomb in a lot of games and a lot of decks. It does have kind of a bad floor. If you don't end up being able to get enough duels, it gets a lot worse. But I still think you take it. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I think maybe next week, depending on how people like this, I might do a list of 10 cards you should be playing more of based on the data. So we'll see what we do, but that could be the topic for next week. So thanks for watching. If you want to watch other episodes of Nizzanotes, you should see the playlist shortly. If you want to see future episodes of Nizzanotes, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you all in the next video.